Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Claire Cooper. I'm part of the social science team with Elaine, my colleague here, with Matthew Cotton. I'm here today to talk to you about the research that we've been doing to look at public perceptions of industrial use of hydrogen, and also in terms of what does that mean in relation to the idea of fair or just transition to a low carbon economy. To set the scene, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the project, then talk about our aims and objectives and some early findings that are coming out of the study. And then I'm going to hand you over back to Matthew for a few minutes, who's going to tell you about a really exciting workshop that we're going to be doing this afternoon that we'd like you all to come along to, if possible. So in terms of this project, why is it important? Well, we've heard from Nash and from others today that, you know, decarbonisation, investment in decarbonisation is really important to the Tees Valley economy. In terms of helping us to reduce carbon emissions, to really achieve our net zero targets, but also create job opportunities, opportunities for retraining, reskilling, but also, as Matthew was just talking about, along with the panellists, help lift families out of poverty in this region. As many of you will know, Teesside has some of the most deprived wards in the country. And parts of the region also have, you know, almost up to 30% of the local workforce economically inactive, and many of those people are not able to work due to ill health. So, however, a successful integration of hydrogen into our industrial and energy landscape is dependent on public support from communities for the transition to hydrogen. But also, it's also important to kind of mention that it's also important to the transition to other renewable energy sources as well. So many people believe that, you know, we just heard in the last session that our industrial heritage on Teesside, our history of grey hydrogen production, means that the public will be accepting of decarbonisation of industry. But the honest reality is that we really don't know an awful lot about what people actually think of the idea of using hydrogen for industrial use, whether it be for power, for heat or transport, or even what people think or understand about the notion of a fair or just transition locally. So to help us answer some of these questions, we've got a number of aims and objectives for the project. So, and these relate to the kind of specific tasks and work packages that we're delivering. So the first piece of work that we've been doing is about looking at what of the literature, academic literature, has been published on perceptions and social acceptance of industrial use of hydrogen. Then we've been using an interview study to explore what the opportunities, barriers and constraints are for bringing about a fair or a just transition to a hydrogen economy on Teesside. We're surveying public perceptions of the risk of hydrogen, so we heard from Stuart about that, and I'd be really interested to see what people's reactions would be if we shared some of those videos. Elaine's doing ethnographic research using observation and informal style interviews to investigate the role of public participation in local energy planning and decision making. And Nash also mentioned earlier that we're hoping using AR or augmented reality to develop a new method that will help communities kind of envision and think about what the future of impact of hydrogen developments might mean for their communities. So just want to kind of touch on the work that we've doing on public perceptions. So to do this work, we've been doing a systematic literature review, looking at perceptions, beliefs, and acceptance of hydrogen and how that, and looking at different terms that are associated with the industrial use of hydrogen across transport, heat, and power. This has generated over 570 articles from 2 academic databases that we've screened, whittled down to about 60 papers for review. So what did we learn as part of that process? Well, there are lots of gaps. Most of the studies that have been done in this space, specifically looking at industrial use, relate to kind of use for public transport, perception of fueling stations, or perception of green or blue hydrogen production. There's been very little that's looked at use of hydrogen across fleet, marine, haulage, rail, and I know Stuart mentioned air transport as well earlier. We also found that there's very little research that's been done that looks at how perceptions of industrial use of hydrogen differ across different scales, spatial scales, and what people think of the idea of an industrial cluster. So what are the factors that influence acceptance of industrial use of hydrogen? Well, I think Usman very kindly sort of talked about some of this earlier, and he's absolutely right in terms of, lack of knowledge and familiarity with the technology is a key factor. But one of the fundamental problems here is that, a lot of this public aren't aware of a lot of this technology yet. These plants haven't been constructed. So how can they know about something that's not already out there? So obviously that's going to create anxiety. So understanding the benefits and the disbenefits of hydrogen for communities was really important, including the perceived costs and risks, and communicating environmental impacts. I know Eddie talked about some of that earlier, but the communities kind of really need to kind of have that information made available so that it can inform their thinking on this. So next I want to kind of move on to the interview study, where we've been looking at how people kind of imagine a just transition to hydrogen in the region. So we focused on a number of different themes, particularly around what are the economic, social and economic opportunities and barriers for industrial use of hydrogen in the region. How do they differ across different spatial contexts, thinking about place? How do they differ within the Tees Valley, so thinking about the different towns, and how do they differ across the supply chain, and what are people's hopes for the future of hydrogen in the region? And we're still busy analysing some of this data, but I kind of want to sort of focus on a couple of key areas using a couple of quotes. So one of the things that we ask people is there anything special about Teesside as a place for hydrogen innovation? The answer overwhelmingly was absolutely yes, as someone very succinctly put it. People told us that the Teesside's infrastructure, its port, its existing pipelines, its our expertise in hydrogen, our scope to potentially store hydrogen underground, and its people is what it makes it a special place for innovation. But also the opportunity to co-locate, to collaborate, maybe share costs in relation to offtakes or other low carbon fuels can possibly be done here in a way that it can't be done elsewhere. And the community were perceived to like industry. It's, as one participant put it, it's in our DNA. We see it as employment, and that means that the community is potentially open to things that are new and different. However, as we've also talked about earlier, the flip side of that is that the a just transition or fair transition to a low carbon economy in the region isn't going to be straightforward. It's not going to be like the transition that we saw to natural gas in the 70s and 80s. We need, participants told us that, we need economies of scale to make things financially viable. But for the transition to be fair, it's really got to be, fair to the entire supply chain, the whole job chain. And that means, as Helen was talking about, trying to find ways to bring people with us on that journey to make sure that no one's left behind. And like Dave said, that we get people interested in the opportunities that are available, that they want to retrain, that they want to help support their kids. I think one person who's in the room, who I won't mention, but in their interview they suggested, why don't we give parents maths and English? Why don't we, create opportunities for, helping them to learn some climate literacy? That could really kind of help push forward a just transition. So in parallel to this research, I mentioned that Elaine has been working on looking at the ethnographic study, looking at how, the public participate in energy planning and decision making. And this research is really, really important because it engagement and influencing of the community often takes place in grassroots level through local informal networks. So understanding, what that's like and what that means is crucial. So some of the interim findings from that work, and Elaine's much better placed than I am to talk about this, but we found that lack of so we found that, for example, opposition to the recent hydrogen project in Redcar, the fact that people weren't necessarily felt consulted or engaged with or listened to or maybe even ignored by civic institutions, industry or commerce meant that, people had heightened pre-existing anxieties that people had about, issues that relate to decline of industry in the area, toxic legacies of contamination on these sites. And that has really important implications for how we communicate science and technology going forward. It's essential that we try and work at a grassroots level to bring those communities with us as part of our journey. So next, I think I want to pass you over very briefly to Matthew to have a quick chat about the workshop this afternoon, which I'm sure he's going to encourage you to come along to, and I'd certainly like to see as many people in the room there.
Thanks, yes. So this afternoon, in the sort of last session of the day, we've got a workshop where we'd like to collect a bit of data from you. Whenever we get like a large group of experts, stakeholders in the room, it's always a good idea to get their perspective on things. So what we've done is from the basis of work that Elaine and Claire have already done in collecting data and some, what we do is we've collected a bunch of statements about hydrogen that relate to just transitions. We've sort of simplified these into a set of 35 items, which basically what we want you to do is you read them, you sort them into the piles, that the ones that you kind of are most like your perspective to the ones that are least like your perspective, and the ones in the middle are neutral. And then you sort of basically sort the statements into this kind of grid pattern. So you store all of the statements relative to one another. So the idea is that you might have something that you very strongly agree with or very strongly disagree with, and then you sort the remaining statements in relation to that sort of pattern. What we then do is you write down the numbers of all the statements in boxes on that grid, and we then take that away. We do like a statistical analysis where we correlate all of these Q sorts that you complete with everyone else is Q sorts, and then you do some factor analysis to see where certain ideas kind of stick together. So what it shows you, unlike a survey which shows you how many people think a certain way, this shows you that if you're concerned about one issue, you're likely to be concerned about another, and vice versa. So it shows you essentially where the ideas are kind of sticky, where they sort of stick together. So it's quite an interesting activity for people to do generally. If you're interested in the topic of hydrogen, you might find it helps to clarify some of your own thinking about these topics, because it forces you to put these statements into a particular order. So if you're interested in taking part in this activity, it'll be about for an hour session. So it'll take you about 20 minutes, half an hour to do this activity, and then we'll kind of discuss the findings in a kind of group after that. And the idea is that we'll get you to sign some consent forms, read the participant information sheet, so we can actually use this in our own research, if that's okay with you. So yeah, if you're interested in taking part, please do pop along this afternoon.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. If anybody has any questions for Claire, and I'll pass the microphone around.
So I grew up in Redcar and then I did a degree in chemistry, and I think everybody in this room is kind of like actively seeking out information through either their workplace or for the studies and this type of stuff. Are people from those deprived areas who aren't seeking out that information, who might not know that it's there, might not want to know, are they being asked these questions as well?
So at the moment, we've been focusing on the views of industry policymakers. That's like one of the work packages that we're doing. But the work that we're developing in the final work package, which is about developing a digital method where people can go and kind of view and project a model or representation of what a plant might look like in their local community. They'll do a transect walk. It's in that kind of environment that we'll be engaging with communities to ask them some of these very questions. But we kind of need to figure out how we scaffold knowledge with them as part of that process. And I know that Elaine's been doing some work as well to kind of talk to people locally about what's going on in this project.
Thank you.
But we need to do more, right?
Hi, Ian McCluskey from the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers. It's probably just a follow-on to your question from the lady beside me, and it's about the consumer and the members of the public. And is your research going to look at who that they would perceive as being trusted advisors, and when they're getting so much information coming to them about the future of decarbonisation, how they're going to heat their homes in the future?
Yeah.
There's so much information out there, whether it's heat pumps, it's all electric, or whether it's a hydrogen boiler, hydrogen-ready boiler, hybrid systems sometimes get talked about as well. Is your research going to identify perhaps who those trusted advisors stroke resources are, where people can get information that they can trust, I guess, to help them with a decision, possibly, for how they're going to heat their homes?
So within the literature, there's already been quite a lot of research that's been done on this. And one of the things that's been identified is that because of the challenges of things like Brexit and other issues that have gone on, that it's often academic institutions that are the trusted gatekeeper for communities. But obviously that can vary, and it can change based on different social contexts. But that'll be something that, the issue of trust will be something that we'll talk to communities as part of the workshops that we're doing. Because this is very much the start of this journey, right? It's, this is just the beginning of learning more, gathering that social intelligence that kind of tells us how people are feeling at this moment in time. But acceptance or even opposition can evolve, it can change. People come in and out of communities. There's lots of questions about how many jobs. And I think when there's maybe a bit more certainty around that, people talk about, how industry is left. So ICI, British Steel, and I've heard people say, well, actually, are you also going to leave? So there's a lot that we need to do in this area to kind of rebuild that trust with communities because of ongoing lack of investment. We've got a lot to do in this space.
Well, thank you. Just one thing, if I can follow up on that. I know I've still got the microphone, but just one thing I'd like to say.
I was going to build on it as well in terms of when you talk about people like that, it's the community catalysts within a community. So it's when we look at the kind of voluntary sector, it's actually finding the organisations who have the hearts and minds of the people that live there. So a big piece of work that we've done as business in the community over the last year is actually find those grassroots people who are trusted. So, for example, we've gone into Dormanstown. They don't want to talk to me. I'm someone who's been parachuted in. They're tired of that. It brings nothing. It hasn't changed their community over generations. But the community catalysts who lie within have those hearts and minds. So the stronger relationships and partnerships. And they'll tell you, and I think that's the disconnect, it's that we can sit in a room and think of what needs to be done, but actually what needs to be done and what needs to be supported on the ground is very different. So there's a big piece of work that needs to be done around crime in Dormanstown to actually help support the work that we're probably all talking about to really support the skills. So it's those community catalysts, and that's really getting to know an area, and then not as that's where we say as businesses, support and nurture that over a longer period of time. So it's not just something we come in and do as a kind of like that silo or ad hoc piece of work, but your community catalysts, we've seen a massive difference just in the last year of having those key people and them being able to affect the impact is just, tenfold to probably what would have been done before.
It's really helpful, thank you.
Hi. It was just a question around the information. How do you plan on using the information at the end of the project? Is it to try and change opinion? Or are you then going to feed back to try and inform whether there's actually a need or a desire for the transition? What's the actual message going to be?
So we would take the outputs from the project and use those to develop policy recommendations for different aspects of what the project relates to. But then also we need to think about, okay, what do we need to do next? So if we know that, for example, science communication is an issue, how do we attempt to begin to tackle that? And going back to what Helen was just saying there, the simple ask of just going out and asking the communities what they would like to learn and how they would like to learn, and then co-designing those projects with them and bringing them with us as part of that journey. For me, I think that's fundamental.
Because I suppose in reality, most people don't know how natural gas gets to their house or what the risks are of natural gas in the home.
Well, it's hidden infrastructure, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very normalised. We switch on the gas, which is, it's an unsafe explosive substance, but we just don't think about it. It's second nature to us. We need to and also we've been transporting hydrogen around in this region without people necessarily knowing anything about it. And we've done that very safely. We need to get that story out there.
Okay, can we all thank Claire then for her presentation? I think it's been fantastic.